Krith stood alone in the center of the combat simulation chamber, her violet skin glistening with sweat under the harsh crystalline lights. Around her, 20 other Zarkanian cadets moved in perfect synchronization, their movements a deadly dance choreographed through their shared telepathic bond. Their training weapons whirred and hummed, cutting through holographic enemies with devastating precision. She tried to anticipate their next formation, but without the telepathic link that connected every other member of her species, she could only rely on her eyes and instincts. A training bolt struck her shoulder, sending a jolt of pain through her body. Another hit her leg. The simulator's difficulty increased, and the holographic enemies multiplied. Cadet Krith. Instructor Valthek's voice boomed through the chamber. "You're disrupting the entire squadron's formation." Again. His disappointment radiated through the telepathic field, felt by everyone except her. The other cadets' annoyance leaked through as well, their emotional disapproval a tangible force that made the air heavy around her. The simulation ended. Krith's squadmates filed past her without a word, their 4 eyes carefully avoiding contact with her too, another marker of her genetic defect. She was the only Zarkanian born in the past century with 2 eyes instead of 4, and the only one without telepathic abilities. Their thoughts didn't need to be spoken. She'd heard the whispers enough times. Defective. Primitive. Evolutionary throwback. In the locker room, Krith removed her training armor, revealing the ceremonial markings that curved along her arms, markings that should have connected her to the collective consciousness of her people. On her, they were just decorative scars, a cruel reminder of what she lacked. Cadet Krith remained behind. Instructor Valthek's voice carried that same disappointed tone. It always did when addressing her. She stood at attention as he approached, his tall frame casting a shadow over her. Unlike the other cadets who found comfort in the Academy's crystal spires that amplified their telepathic bonds, Krith felt suffocated by them. The crystals seemed to mock her with their silent songs that everyone else could hear. "The Academy Board is meeting tomorrow to discuss your status," Valthek said, his secondary eyes scanning a holographic report while his primary eyes studied her face. "Your combat scores are problematic. Your academic performance is exceptional, but a Zarkanian officer who cannot participate in group combat formations is still a Zarkanian," Krith interrupted, immediately regretting her outburst. "I apologize, Instructor, but I've developed alternative combat strategies. If I could just demonstrate alternative strategies." Valthek's tone sharpened. "Our military doctrine has been perfected over 10,000 years of telepathic coordination. There are no alternatives." The Academy's warning chimes echoed through the halls, signaling the day's final rotation. Valthek left her alone in the training chamber, his disapproval lingering like a bad taste in the air. Krith waited until the corridors emptied before making her way to the Academy's information center. She had discovered that the night shift guards didn't pay much attention to the defective cadet who spent her evenings alone in the archives. Tonight, something new waited in the intelligence feeds, reports about a species called humans. The holographic displays showed their ships moving in what appeared to be chaos to Zarkanian military analysts. No telepathic coordination, no perfect geometric formations. Yet they had managed to establish colonies across 3 star systems. They fought as individuals. Krith's heart raced as she downloaded the reports to her personal device. Finally, proof that there was another way to fight, to exist. As she studied the human battle footage, she didn't see primitive chaos. She saw freedom. She saw possibility. She saw hope. The invasion began with mathematical precision. Krith watched from her observation post as the Zarkanian fleet emerged from hyperspace in perfect hexagonal formation, their crystalline ships catching the light of Earth's sun. Her assignment to this remote station was meant to be a punishment, a way to keep the defective cadet from embarrassing the Academy during the glorious first strike against humanity. Through the station's quantum lens array, she observed the human colony of New Eden. Unlike the geometric perfection of Zarkanian cities, the human settlement sprawled organically across the planet's surface, its buildings following the natural contours of the landscape. Their ships patrolled in seemingly random patterns that made her people's tactical AI systems struggle to predict their movements. "Begin the purification," came the telepathic broadcast from High Command, resonating through the station's crystal amplifiers. Krith couldn't hear it directly, but her monitoring equipment translated the signal. She watched as the first wave of Zarkanian destroyers descended toward the colony, their formation unwavering. Then something unexpected happened. The human ships scattered like startled birds, breaking into smaller groups that seemed to move without pattern or purpose. Krith's instruments recorded numerous tactical officers dismissing them as primitive, uncoordinated prey. That was their first mistake. 3 human vessels suddenly reversed course, diving between the gaps in the Zarkanian formation. Gaps that existed because the formation was too perfect, too predictable. Their weapons weren't as powerful, their shields weren't as strong, but they didn't need to be. They struck at junction points that tactical doctrine said should be impossible to target while moving at such speeds. 2 Zarkanian destroyers erupted in crystalline flowers of destruction. The perfect formation wavered as the collective consciousness struggled to adapt to this impossibility. Krith found herself leaning forward, eyes wide, as she documented everything in her personal logs. Tactical analysis, her superior officer, Commander Zelvin, demanded through the station's communication system. How are they achieving these results? Krith's fingers flew over her console. Sir, they're not fighting according to any known doctrine. Each ship appears to be making independent tactical decisions based on immediate circumstances rather than following collective strategic protocols. Impossible. No military force can function without central coordination. Continue monitoring and await further instructions. But Krith couldn't look away. She watched as more human ships emerged from hidden positions in the debris field, attacking from angles that violated every principle of conventional space combat. Their formations looked chaotic until she began to see the underlying logic. They weren't moving randomly, they were adapting. Each ship acted on its own initiative while somehow maintaining a broader strategic goal. The casualty reports began flooding in. 3 more Zarkanian capital ships lost. Then 5. The perfect formation had become a perfect target. When High Command finally ordered a retreat, nearly a third of the invasion fleet had been destroyed. Krith's hands trembled as she compiled her observations. The humans hadn't just defeated a superior force, they had done it by embracing the very thing her people considered a weakness. Individual thought, independent action, adaptation. Delete those records, Commander Zelvin ordered, his voice cold. The official report will show that the humans used unknown technology to interfere with our coordination networks. We cannot acknowledge that their primitive individualism achieved any measure of success. Krith's finger hovered over the delete command. Then, slowly, she began transferring her real observations to a hidden partition in her personal device. For the first time in her life, she understood that her defect might actually be something else entirely. Something powerful. As she watched the human ships resume their seemingly chaotic patrol patterns, a new thought crystallized in her mind. Perhaps the true flaw wasn't in her, but in a society so rigid it couldn't recognize different forms of strength. The humans had proven that today. And somehow, she knew this was only the beginning. The observation post's warning sirens howled as another explosion rocked the structure. Krith stumbled against her console, the impact leaving a violet smear of blood where her head struck the edge. Through the viewport, she watched the last Zarkanian shuttle disappear into hyperspace, carrying her superior officers to safety. They hadn't even tried to reach her section of the station. Emergency protocols initiated, the station's AI announced. Hull breach detected in sectors 7 through 9, initiating compartment sealing in 3 minutes. Krith grabbed her emergency kit and ran. Her boots echoed on the metal deck plates as she navigated the labyrinthine corridors. The station's crystalline architecture, usually gleaming with telepathic resonance, now pulsed an angry red with emergency lighting. Without the collective consciousness to guide her, She had to rely on memorized evacuation routes. A sudden explosion from behind threw her forward. She rolled with the impact, a trick she'd learned from studying human combat footage. The heat of plasma fire washed over her as she scrambled behind a support beam. Someone was on the station. Life signs detected in forward section. A rough voice called out in accented Zarkanian. Sweep and clear, standard protocol. Krith held her breath. Humans. They must have boarded during the evacuation. She pressed herself deeper into the shadows, knowing her violet skin would stand out against the station's pale walls. Her hand brushed against her sidearm, but she'd never fired it outside of simulations. 2 minutes until compartment sealing. The AI reminded everyone left aboard. Heavy bootfalls approached her position. Krith saw him first, a human warrior in scared combat armor, his helmet's faceplate cracked but still intact. He moved with the fluid grace of a predator, checking corners and sightlines. Unlike the rigid movements she'd been taught at the academy, his were unpredictable, adaptive. He turned, and their eyes met. Time seemed to freeze. Krith saw her own reflection in his faceplate, a two-eyed Zarkanian in a cadet's uniform, clearly no threat to a seasoned warrior. He raised his weapon, then paused. "You're not like the others," he said, this time in human standard. His helmet's translator rendered it in broken Zarkanian. "I'm defective," Krith replied in his language, surprising them both. "That's why they left me." The human was silent for a moment. Then, slowly, he reached up and removed his helmet. The face beneath was covered in sweat and blood, with features unlike any she'd seen outside of briefing documents. His eyes, only two of them, studied her with an intensity that reminded her of her own reflection. "I'm Marcus Chen," he said, "Special Operations. And I don't think you're defective at all." Another explosion rocked the station. Marcus stumbled, and Krith saw the wound in his side that his armor had been hiding. He'd stayed behind to cover his team's retreat, just as she'd observed in human battle tactics. 1 minute until compartment sealing. The AI announced cheerfully. "The station's going to decompress," Krith said. "We need tow. We need to move." Marcus finished her sentence, managing a pained smile. "Got any ideas, cadet?" Krith's mind raced. The evacuation pods were gone, but the maintenance tubes, they're shielded against decompression. We can reach the secondary control room. Marcus nodded, then tossed her a spare weapon from his belt. The trust in that gesture, from an enemy soldier to a defective cadet, made her throat tight. 30 seconds until compartment sealing. They ran together through the dying station, human and Zarkanian, each broken in their own way, but somehow stronger for it. As they reached the maintenance tube access, Krith realized that for the first time in her life, she wasn't alone in being different. And somehow, that made all the difference in the universe. The secondary control room hummed with the dying station's remaining power. Krith worked on the life support systems while Marcus kept watch, his wounded side propped against a console. The room's emergency lights cast strange shadows across his alien features, making him look both fearsome and vulnerable at the same time. "Why did you stay behind?" Krith asked, her fingers dancing across the control panel. "Your unit escaped. Tactical doctrine would dictate." "Sometimes you have to throw doctrine out the airlock," Marcus interrupted, checking his weapons charge. "My team needed time. I gave them time." He winced as he shifted position. "Besides, tactical doctrine also says I should have shot you on sight." Krith's hands paused over the controls. "Then why didn't you?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, studying her with those singular pair of eyes that matched her own. "Because I recognize something in you. Something I've seen in mirrors all my life." The life support system chirped, confirming the restoration of atmospheric pressure in their section. Krith moved to examine Marcus's wound, applying a medical patch from her emergency kit. The blood that seeped through was red, so different from her own violet shade. "On Earth," Marcus continued, his voice tight with pain, "we have a saying. The nail that sticks out gets hammered down. It's about conformity, about forcing everyone to be the same. He managed a grim smile. Never made much sense to me. All the greatest changes in human history came from people who stuck out, who thought differently. Like who? Krith asked, genuinely curious. The Academy had taught them that humans were chaotic, primitive, dangerous. But sitting here, tending to this warrior's wounds, she saw something else entirely. Leonardo da Vinci, who saw possibilities others couldn't imagine. Marie Curie, who pursued knowledge even when it killed her. Yuri Gagarin, who dared to reach for the stars when everyone said it was impossible. Marcus's eyes grew distant. My grandmother, who escaped a re-education camp with nothing but her wits and refused to let them break her spirit. Krith finished securing the medical patch. Your people celebrate these differences. Not always. Not everyone. But enough do. Marcus checked the patch, nodding in approval at her work. That's the thing about humans. We're contradictory. We fear what's different, but we need it. Every major breakthrough, every revolution, every step forward came from someone who didn't fit in. A distant explosion reminded them of their precarious situation. Krith moved to the station's sensors, scanning for pursuit ships. The Academy teaches that your individualism makes you weak, that only through perfect unity can civilization advance. Marcus laughed, then grimaced at the pain it caused. Perfect unity. Sounds like a perfect prison to me. Look at how your fleet fought today. Beautiful formations, perfect coordination, and completely unable to adapt when we didn't follow their predictions. I saw, Krith said quietly. I've been studying your battle tactics. They're beautiful in their own way, like a dance where every partner moves to their own rhythm, yet somehow creates something greater. That's poetry right there. Marcus grinned. You sure you're not part human? Before Krith could respond, the station's sensors blared a warning. 3 Zarkanian pursuit vessels had dropped out of hyperspace, their formations precise and deadly. They're coming back for something, Marcus said, struggling to his feet. And I don't think it's a rescue mission. Krith's hands clenched on the console. She knew he was right. They weren't coming to save the defective cadet. They were coming to ensure she couldn't reveal what she'd seen today. That humans weren't the primitives they'd been portrayed as. That individual thought wasn't a weakness to be purged. Then we'd better give them something they can't predict, she said, feeling a strange calm settle over her. Think you're up for teaching me some of those unpredictable human tactics. Marcus checked his weapon one more time, a fierce light in his eyes. Cadet, I thought you'd never ask. While Marcus jury-rigged the station's defense systems, Krith dove deep into the classified databases. Her fingers trembled as she bypassed security protocols. Not from fear, but from growing anger. Each new file she decrypted painted a darker picture of her people's true motives. They knew, she whispered, violet skin paling as she read. They knew about others like me. Marcus looked up from the weapons console he was rewiring. What do you mean? Project Purity. Krith's voice cracked as she transferred the files to a secure display. It wasn't just about me. There were others born without telepathic abilities. Hundreds of us. But they were processed, reconditioned, hidden away. The classified footage showed sterile white rooms where 2-eyed Zarkanian children underwent treatments. Their screams had been muted, but their faces told stories that made Krith's hearts clench. Only her assignment to the Academy had saved her from the same fate. That's not even the worst part, she continued, opening another file. The first contact with humans wasn't 3 months ago like they claimed. They'd been watching Earth for years, studying your species, and they found something that terrified them. The display shifted to show human brain scans next to Zarkanian ones. Your neural patterns. They're similar to those of us born without telepathy. The scientists theorized that prolonged exposure to humans could wake something up in our people, make them question the collective. Marcus stopped working, his face grim. So this war was never about protecting our empire from primitive savages. Krith's hands clenched into fists. It was about protecting the system of control. They couldn't risk their perfect unity being infected by human ideas about individuality and free will. A warning klaxon interrupted them. The pursuit ships were beginning their docking procedures, their telepathic signatures growing stronger as they approached. Krith felt sick as she now understood what those signatures truly represented. Not unity, but chains. "We need to move," Marcus said, checking the nearest airlock display. "My escape pod is still docked on level 3. If we can." "No." Krith was still reading, her eyes wide. "These files, they have to know. Everyone has to know. The collective consciousness doesn't just connect our people, it suppresses them, makes them easier to control. That's why they cut off anyone who starts thinking independently." The station's crystals began resonating with approaching telepathic energy. Soon, the recovery team would breach the hull. Krith knew their orders would be simple: eliminate the defective one and any evidence of human contamination. Marcus grabbed her shoulder, turning her to face him. "Krith, we're out of time." She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw what her people feared. Not a primitive, but a free mind. Someone who chose his own path, who stayed behind to save others not because of programming or collective will, but because he decided it was right. "There's a data burst transmitter in the primary control room," she said. "If I can upload these files to the emergency broadcast network, every Zarkanian ship in the sector will receive them. They won't be able to suppress the truth anymore." "That's suicide," Marcus said. "The primary control room is exposed. They'll reach it before we can secure the transmission." Krith touched the medical patch on his side, remembering his words about those who changed history by daring to be different. "Then I'll go alone. You take the escape pod. I've spent my whole life being ashamed of what I am. Maybe it's time I used it to do something that matters." The sound of cutting torches echoed through the station's corridors. The recovery team was inside. Marcus checked his weapon's charge one last time, then ejected the power cell and handed it to her. "Like hell you're doing this alone," he said, slamming a fresh cell into place. "Besides, someone needs to teach you how to make an unpredictable entrance." The maintenance shaft erupted in a shower of sparks as Krith and Marcus burst through, plasma fire scorching the walls behind them. The recovery team's synchronized movements might have been beautiful if they weren't trying to kill them. "Remember what I said about predictability?" Marcus called out, firing backward without looking. His shot caught a pursuer in the shoulder, not where they expected him to aim. "They're thinking as one mind. Use it against them." Krith understood. The collective consciousness meant perfect coordination, but also perfect predictability. She grabbed Marcus's arm and pulled him left instead of right at the next junction, exactly opposite to standard evacuation protocols. "The data core is 3 levels up," she said, her heart's pounding. "But they'll expect us to take the direct route." Marcus grinned through the pain of his wound. "So let's disappoint them." They dove into the station's waste reclamation tube, a move so illogical that the pursuing team took precious seconds to adjust. Krith felt the telepathic ripple of their confusion, even though she couldn't hear it directly. The tube's anti-grav field let them fall upward, emerging 2 levels higher than their pursuers expected. "They're splitting up to cover multiple approaches," Krith said, reading the tactical displays on her wrist unit. "Standard containment doctrine." "Standard is boring," Marcus replied, pulling a small device from his armor. "Watch this human trick." He tossed the device down the corridor they didn't take. Seconds later, holographic images of them appeared, running in the exact pattern the recovery team would expect. The pursuit split, half following the decoys. "My grandmother used to smuggle contraband past surveillance drones with tricks like that," Marcus explained as they moved in the opposite direction. "Sometimes the best path is the one that makes no sense." They reached a sealed pressure door. Beyond it lay the secondary data core, not their actual target, but close enough to make their pursuers think they were cornered. Krith placed her hand on the security scanner. "Wait," Marcus said, studying the door. "They'll expect you to use your credentials. They'll be monitoring." Krith smiled. Exactly. She pressed her hand down, and alarms blared throughout the sector. As the recovery team converged on their position, she and Marcus slipped into a maintenance duct that ran parallel to the main corridor. "I've been studying this station's layout for months," she whispered as they crawled through the narrow space. "Everyone else relies on the collective to navigate. I had to memorize everything." They emerged behind the recovery team, who were busy breaching the sealed door. Krith's defect had become their advantage. No one could predict their moves because she wasn't part of the shared consciousness. "The primary data core is one level up," Krith said, checking her wrist display. "But there's a problem. The transmission array is damaged. We'll need to reroute through the emergency beacon system." Marcus wedged himself into a corner, covering both approaches while she worked on an access panel. "How long?" 2 minutes to reconfigure the signal. Then maybe 30 seconds to upload the files. She looked up at him. "They'll know exactly where we are the moment I start the transmission. Then we'll give them something else to think about." Marcus pulled his last remaining charges from his armor. "You know what's funny? In all our briefings about Zarkanians, they never mentioned how beautiful your eyes are. Just kept going on about how 4 eyes were superior to 2. Krith's fingers paused on the panel. "In all our briefings about humans, they never mentioned how infuriatingly unpredictable your timing is for personal observations." Marcus laughed softly. "That's what makes us dangerous, remember? Now come on, defective. Let's show them why being different is a gift." Above them, the station's crystals hummed with approaching telepathic energy as more recovery teams converged on their position. But for the first time in her life, Krith didn't feel their absence in her mind as a curse. She felt it as freedom. The primary data core of Gateway Station pulsed with dying light as Krith's fingers flew across the console. Behind her, Marcus had barricaded the entrance with everything they could move, but the sound of plasma cutters was getting closer. "Transmission array reconfigured," she announced, violet blood dripping from a cut above her eye. "Broadcasting on all emergency frequencies. The files are uploading now." Marcus checked the charge on his weapon. Nearly depleted. "How many ships are in range?" 17 Zarkanian vessels, including 3 civilian transports. Krith's heart clenched as she watched the progress bar crawl forward. "But the signal's weak. We need more power to reach them all." The station shuddered as another recovery team tried to breach through the floor below. Marcus's makeshift explosives had bought them time, but the hunting parties were adapting to their tactics now, learning from each failed attempt. "There has to be a way to boost the signal," Marcus said, pressing a hand against his reopened wound. "What about the station's crystal matrix?" Krith's eyes widened. "The telepathic amplifiers. They're not designed to carry data transmissions. But they could, right?" Marcus moved to her console, leaving a smear of red blood beside her violet stains. "You said the crystals enhance neural patterns. These files are neural recordings, the evidence of what they did to others like you." She saw where his thinking led and felt cold. "Yes, but to repurpose the matrix, someone would have to manually reconfigure the resonance chamber. The controls are on the other side of that door, and the moment we open it, they'll be waiting." Marcus nodded, then gave her that infuriating human smile. "Good thing they're expecting 2 of us." Krith grabbed his arm. "No, we can find another way. There's always another way." "That's very human of you to say." He touched her hand gently. "But sometimes the unpredictable choice is the only one that works. You taught me that." The door groaned as another cutting beam pierced its edge. They had minutes, maybe less. "The files have to get out," Marcus continued, checking the charges on his remaining weapons. "Your people need to know the truth. About the war, about the suppressions, about all of it. And you need to be alive to help them understand it." "Marcus." Krith's voice broke as she realized she couldn't stop him. He pressed his tactical display unit into her hands. "My grandmother used to say that true strength isn't about being fearless. It's about being terrified, and doing the right thing anyway." His eyes met hers, Two eyes meeting two eyes, both pairs filled with tears. Your defect isn't a flaw, Krith. It's the future. A future worth dying for. The door's integrity field flickered. Time was up. When I hit the release, you'll have 30 seconds to reach the emergency pod in Shaft 9, he said, his voice steady despite the pain. Don't argue. Don't look back. Just promise me you'll make this mean something. Krith wanted to argue, to find another solution, to do anything except watch another person sacrifice themselves for her. But she saw in his eyes the same thing she'd seen in the classified files, the power of a single mind, choosing its own path. I promise, she whispered, pressing her forehead to his in the traditional Zarkanian farewell. May your spirit fly free among the stars. Marcus smiled one last time. Already has. Then he turned to the door, weapon ready. Now show them what one defective and one primitive can do to change the universe. The door burst open in a shower of molten metal. Krith ran, Marcus's war cry echoing behind her. She ran as plasma fire filled the corridor, as explosions shook the station, as alarms screamed through every deck. She ran, carrying the truth, carrying his sacrifice, carrying the hope of a future where being different wasn't a curse but a gift. She ran, and she didn't look back. The explosion that claimed Gateway Station lit up space like a newborn star. Krith watched through the escape pod's viewport as the crystal matrix overloaded, sending waves of disrupted telepathic energy washing over the gathered Zarkanian fleet. In that moment, thousands of minds experienced something they never had before. Silence. Her pod's communication system crackled with confused transmissions. For the first time in generations, Zarkanian ships broke formation. Some drifted aimlessly as their crews struggled with sudden mental isolation. Others moved with newfound purpose, their captains making decisions without the collective's guidance. This is Acting Captain Valson of the Civilian Transport Morning Light, a familiar voice broadcast on all frequencies. I have received the data transmission. The evidence cannot be denied. The suppression of our own people, the lies about the humans. We have all been deceived. More voices joined in, each speaking not with the perfect unity of the collective, but with individual inflection and emotion. Krith recognized some of them. Other defectives who had hidden their condition, forced to pretend they could hear the telepathic symphony that had become a cage. Her pod's emergency beacon picked up approaching ships, not in perfect formation, but in a loose, adaptive pattern that reminded her of human tactics. She smiled through her tears, knowing Marcus would have appreciated the irony. The rescue shuttle that retrieved her was commanded by a young officer with two eyes. She didn't hide them behind the ceremonial lenses that most corrected Zarkanians wore. As Krith stepped aboard, other crew members revealed their own differences. Varied eye counts, unique skin patterns, all the natural diversity that the Empire had tried to suppress. We received the files, the commander said, her voice thick with emotion. All of them. The hidden labs, the reconditioning centers, the real reason for the war. When the station's crystal matrix overloaded, it didn't just break the collective's connection. It broke the conditioning that made us fear being different. Krith looked out at the gathered ships, now organizing themselves through choice rather than compulsion. How many? Nearly 30% of our people were born with variations that the Empire labeled as defects. They forced most into treatment or hid them in plain sight. The commander's hands tightened on the shuttle's controls. But that's over now. Your human friend saw to that. Marcus, Krith said softly. His name was Marcus Chen. And he died so we could choose our own path. News spread across Zarkanian space at FTL speeds. The rigid formations of the Imperial fleet dissolved as ship after ship declared independence from the collective. The revolution wasn't fought with weapons, but with truth. The truth that diversity wasn't weakness, that individual thought wasn't a flaw to be corrected. 3 cycles later, Krith stood before the newly formed Council of Free Minds. The chamber, once designed to amplify the collective consciousness, had been reformed into a place where all voices could be heard equally. She wore her two eyes proudly now, and the ceremonial markings on her arms had been redrawn to tell her own story, not the Empire's. "The humans have offered peace talks," she announced to the gathered representatives. "They ask only that we acknowledge their right to remain individual, and that we extend the same right to our own people." The council chamber filled not with the silence of telepathic communion, but with the beautiful chaos of vocal discussion. Some opposed, some supported, each speaking their own mind. Krith smiled, remembering Marcus's words about the power of unpredictability. A memorial had been placed in the chamber center, a simple hologram showing two eyes meeting two eyes across the divide of space. Beneath it, words in both human and Zarkanian script read, "To those who dare to be different, for they light the way forward." Krith touched the memorial gently. "We made it mean something," she whispered to Marcus's memory. "We made it mean everything." Above the council chamber, the stars shone on a civilization learning to embrace its differences, guided by the sacrifice of one human who proved that the greatest strength lies not in unity, but in the courage to stand apart.